Right now, billions of searches are happening. Every second, Google processes roughly 99,000 queries. People finding doctors, finding directions, finding each other. And virtually none of those people have ever heard the name Alan Emtage. That is not an accident, that is a story. In 1990, a 24-year-old graduate student from Barbados, sitting in a basement at McGill University in Montreal, built the first tool that could search the internet. Not a version of search, not a precursor to search in some loose metaphorical sense. The actual first search engine, he called it Archie. He gave it away for free because that was simply what you did, because the internet was still a place where people shared things without asking what they would get back. And then the world moved on without him. Google was incorporated in 1998. By 2004, its IPO valued the company at $23 billion. Today, that number is closer to $2 trillion. Alan Emtage has never received a single dollar from any of it. But this story is not really about money. It is about something more corrosive, the systematic erasure of a Black Caribbean man from the founding mythology of one of the most consequential technologies in human history. And the way that erasure was made possible, in part, by his own generosity. Alan Emtage was born in Bridgetown, Barbados, in 1964. He was the kind of child who took things apart not out of mischief, but out of a genuine need to understand how mechanisms worked, what governed them, what the rules were underneath the surface. He was formally educated in the British tradition, rigorous, classical, precise, and when he arrived at McGill University in Montreal in the late 1980s to pursue a master's degree in computer science, he stepped into a world that was, for someone like him, almost cosmically well-timed. The internet in 1989 was not what the word conjures now. There was no World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee would not publish his proposal for the web until March of that year, and it would not become publicly available until 1991. What existed was a loose, decentralized network of university computers, research institutions, and government servers, connected by protocols that allowed them to exchange data. It was fast, by the standards of the moment, and powerful, and almost completely invisible to anyone who did not already know exactly where to look. Emtage worked as a systems administrator for McGill's School of Computer Science. Part of his job was maintaining access to software repositories scattered across the network, anonymous FTP servers, essentially open warehouses of files hosted by institutions around the world. If you wanted a particular piece of code or a specific document, you had to already know which server held it and navigate there manually. There was no map. There was no directory. The internet was a library with no card catalog, no index, no way of knowing what was on which shelf, unless someone had told you personally. This bothered Emtage in the specific, nagging way that a problem bothers someone who is constitutionally incapable of leaving it unsolved. He started writing a program that would reach out across the network, visit FTP servers automatically, and collect the names of the files stored on each one. Then it would index those names locally. Then it would let you query that index using a simple search command. You typed what you were looking for. The program told you where it lived on the network. That was Archie, named simply for the word archive with the V dropped to make it shorter to type. The elegance of it is easy to understate from this distance. Emtage had essentially invented the crawler index query architecture that still underlies every modern search engine. A bot that moves through the network gathering information, a structured index of what it finds, and a retrieval interface that returns relevant results in response to a user request. Google, Bing, every search engine you have ever used operates on this same fundamental logic. The machinery beneath the magic has not changed in its essential structure since a graduate student in Montreal sketched it out in 1990. He and his collaborators, fellow McGill students Bill Whelan and Peter Deutsch, deployed Archie on a McGill server in September 1990. Within weeks, universities across North America were mirroring it and pointing their users toward it. Within months, Archie was processing thousands of queries a day. Within a year, it had become the de facto navigation tool for the internet, not just in North America, but globally, as the network expanded to connect institutions in Europe, Asia, and beyond. For a technology that would later be worth trillions of dollars in aggregate, this is worth pausing on. The world's first search engine reached global adoption in approximately 12 months, built by one person in his spare time, running on a single university server. It was not funded. It was not licensed. It was not protected by a patent. It was simply released, freely, into the commons of the early internet, because Emtage and his colleagues believed that the right thing to do with a useful tool was to make it available to everyone. And here is the pivot that makes this story what it is. That decision to give Archie away, to treat it as a public good rather than a commercial asset, was not a naive mistake. It was a value. It reflected a philosophy that was nearly universal among the people building the early internet, a philosophy that had been articulated explicitly in documents like the GNU Manifesto and practiced daily in the culture of open-source software development. You built something good, you shared it, others built on it, and the whole edifice rose together. The idea of privatizing a piece of fundamental internet infrastructure would have seemed, to most people in that community in 1990, almost obscene. But that philosophy had a structural blind spot. It assumed that credit would track with contribution, that the person who built the thing first would be recognized as the person who built the thing first, that history would be legible. It wasn't. By 1993, the World Wide Web was live and expanding rapidly. Mosaic, the first graphical web browser, launched that year. The internet was no longer the domain of university researchers and government scientists. It was becoming something that ordinary people could navigate, and ordinary people needed tools to find things on it. A new generation of developers, many of them students, many of them working in exactly the same conditions Emtage had worked in 3 years earlier, began building web-specific search tools. WebCrawler launched in 1994. Lycos launched in 1994. Alta Vista launched in 1995. Yahoo launched its directory in 1995. And in 1998, 2 Stanford PhD students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin launched a search engine called Google. None of them invented the search engine. Emtage did, but the story that calcified in the culture of Silicon Valley and then in the popular press and then in the history books and the documentaries and the Wikipedia articles was a story about the web era. Archie predated the web, which meant, in the retelling, it was easy to bracket off, to treat as a primitive precursor rather than the actual origin point. There is a cruelty in that framing that takes a moment to fully register. Emtage did not fail to invent search. He succeeded completely 3 years before his successors got started. The technology he built was not superseded because it was insufficient. It was superseded because the web created a new and vastly larger surface to search, and web-specific tools were built to address that surface. The architecture of those tools was the same architecture Emtage had established. But the web gave later inventors a clean narrative break, a moment they could point to and say, this is where search really began. It began in Montreal in 1990 in a graduate student's spare hours on a McGill server. That is the documented fact. Emtage was not unaware of what was happening. He watched the web-era search engines emerge, watched venture capital pour into them, watched the valuations climb. He gave interviews. He spoke at conferences. He was unfailingly clear about the historical record. Archie came first. The architecture was the same. The genealogy was traceable. He was not silent. He was simply not heard in proportion to what he had done. Part of that has to do with who he was. The early internet had a canonical cast of characters, almost all of them white, almost all of them American or European, almost all of them men in specific institutional networks at specific universities. Emtage was Caribbean, black, operating out of a Canadian university rather than MIT or Stanford or Xerox PARC. He did not fit the silhouette of the founding genius as the technology press had learned to see it. This is not speculation. It is a pattern documented extensively in the history of technology, in the history of science, in the history of nearly every field where the question of who gets credited has been studied seriously. The people who are centered in founding mythologies look a certain way. Emtage did not look that way, and in the absence of a patent, a company, or a financial claim that would have forced the record to engage with his prior art, the erasure was quiet, and nearly total. By the early 2000s, the world Google had built was already reshaping commerce, information, politics, and human cognition at a scale that had no historical precedent. The company went public in 2004. Page and Brin became billionaires. The narrative of their genius, two Stanford students who built something the world had never seen, was repeated so many times it became self-reinforcing. No patent suit compelled anyone to revisit Archie. No licensing agreement put Emtige's name in the fine print. He had given the technology away, and the world had taken it and moved on. Emtige built a career in internet infrastructure and security. He co-founded a company called Bunyip Information Systems, which commercialized Archie briefly in the early 1990s, though without the financial scale that would have cemented his legacy in the way that a successful IPO might have. He has continued to work in technology. He has continued to speak about Archie's history, to advocate for recognition of early internet pioneers, to participate in the conversations about what the web was and where it came from. He is not a broken man. He is not a cautionary tale about someone crushed by failure. He is something more unsettling, a man who succeeded completely, who built exactly what he set out to build, who contributed something foundational to one of the most important technologies in human history, and who has watched others receive wealth and glory for a version of the thing he made first. In 2012, the Internet Hall of Fame inducted Alan Emtige as one of its inaugural members. It was an acknowledgement. It was overdue. It was also in the context of a $2 trillion industry that rests in part on the architecture he conceived, a modest gesture. What this story asks of us, and it does ask something, is a reckoning with how we build the histories of technologies. We tend to tell innovation stories backward, starting from success and tracing the lineage toward whoever currently holds the money and the fame. That method of storytelling systematically advantages those who arrive later with capital and cultural legibility, and it systematically erases those who arrived first without either. Emtige had the idea. He had the skill. He had the discipline and the timing. What he did not have was a patent attorney, a venture capitalist, and a demographic profile that fit the inherited image of a tech founder in 1990. Open-source philosophy that animated his decision to release Archie freely was, and remains, genuinely noble. The free exchange of knowledge is not a mistake, but it operates in a world that does not always honor the social contract that philosophy assumes, the contract that says contribution will be seen, and credit will follow. When that contract breaks down, the losses are not evenly distributed. They fall on the people who were already less likely to be centered in the story to begin with. There is a version of internet history, the accurate version, in which a young man from Barbados sits down in a Montreal basement and builds the technology that makes all of it possible, in which the architecture he conceived in 1990 is still running in elaborated form every time you type a word into a search box, in which his name appears where Page and Brin's names appear, not because their work was not real, but because the lineage is real and lineage should be legible. That version of history exists. It just has not been told at volume. Alan Emtige built the card catalog for the largest library humanity has ever created, and then history filed him in the back, in a section most people never reach. The next time you search for something and the answer appears in under a second, know that the man who made that possible spent his graduate school nights building a tool he gave you for free. His name is Alan Emtige. Say it out loud. It deserves to be heard.